Robert F. Kennedy Jr. took part in a 2024 town hall with Fox News and clashed with moderator Sean Hannity over the West's role in provoking the war in Ukraine. Let's watch.
In 2019, France, Germany, and Russia all agreed to the Minsk Accords. That year, Zelensky ran for president. He was a comedian. He had no political experience. Why did he win? Because he ran on one issue, signing the Minsk Accords. As soon as he got in there, Victoria Nuland in the White House told him he couldn't do it. Then Putin sends 40,000 troops in. That's not enough to conquer the country. Clearly, he wanted us to come to the negotiation. He wanted somebody to come to a negotiating table. Zelensky came to the negotiating table, signed a new agreement that was the Minsk Accords 2 in 2022, and that would have allowed Donbass to stay, and Lugansk to remain as part of Ukraine. We said Putin signed it, Zelensky initialed it, and Putin, in good faith, began withdrawing troops from the Ukraine. What happened? We sent Boris Johnson over there to torpedo it because we don't want peace we want the war with Russia.
Yeah, so there is RFK Jr., talking about the mistakes that were made by U.S. foreign policy that helped get us to this point. And I've heard him, talk about this before. It is not to acquit Russia of wrongdoing or to condone the invasion. He says very clearly, and others who are skeptical of the continued funding of this war effort, such as myself, will say that Russia is absolutely at fault for sending in troops. That was an escalation of hostilities that has led to needless suffering and death. But you can still critique the diplomatic choices of the U.S. and our Western partners that helped get us to this point. The reality is that we have mismanaged the post-Cold War relationship with Russia. What should have been friendly outreach and closer ties became militarism and standoffishness and trying to isolate them vis-a-vis the expansion of NATO. And now here we are. And yes, right, Zelensky was elected with a mandate to resolve this, to not go in a more aggressive direction. And the West totally got in the way of that.
Yeah, I think it's so bad how the tweets and the taking out of context from RFK Jr. is going following this town hall. Here's a Fox News audience erupting in applause at RFK Jr. claiming Putin acted in, quote, good faith, but was forced to invade Ukraine because, quote, the U.S. wants war with Russia. It's really interesting because there are going to be so many liberals who are like, so Putin acted in good faith by invading Ukraine? What is this RFK Jr. guy saying? That's how this always goes, the taking things out of context. I think his criticism of U.S. foreign policy in that context was fair, and it was coming from the perspective of how do we avoid conflict? Like, what's in the interest of the least loss of human lives? And let's also understand the diplomatic priorities of both Ukraine and Russia and what they're going to be fighting for here. U.S. intervention abroad, I think, is something that the American populace has become so critical of. They see the billions of dollars that we spend, how our military budget dwarfs every other country. They see the lack of resources going towards investment in our infrastructure. That makes people very upset. The forever wars debate is something that's becoming increasingly bipartisan in our favor of isolationist foreign policy. Does American intervention make a situation that's hostile, like the situation between Russia and Ukraine, do we make it better or worse by intervening there militarily? Right. Overwhelmingly worse. Yet you had so many people at the beginning of the invasion calling for the U.S. instating a no-fly zone. And I think that might be a lack of understanding of what that means on behalf of many Americans, right? It sounds very nice. We put this magical bubble over, no planes can fly through. That's not how it goes. We would have to send troops there. We would have to have military technology on the ground necessary to shoot down planes. This would be an active involvement in the Russian war in Ukraine and the Russian invasion, the U.S. intervening on behalf of Ukraine. Now, world war is going to break out. That's really what they were asking for by asking for a no-fly zone. I think people like RFK Jr. because he's isolationist. He's not saying Putin's a good guy here.
Right. And he's definitely not. But
yeah.
But doesn't, as you point out, it clearly doesn't serve our interests. Even if we're just thinking,
right.
What is best for the U.S.? It's not best for the U.S. to have World War III with Russia.
No.
Or to have a conflict. Right. No, we don't want this. And we have to evaluate the steps that neoconservatives in both the Republican and Democratic Party, and just, the State Department, the federal bureaucracy that's always there, regardless of who's in charge, helped get us to this point. Consciously made choices. Victoria Nuland type people made choices that got us to this place. Mm-hmm. Now, Kennedy also spoke with Sean Hannity defending his recent comments on COVID-19 and race. Let's watch that.
And I was describing a 2021 study that was funded by NIH, that was performed by a half a dozen at least scientists, the three lead scientists from Cleveland Clinic. And that study showed that the docking site for on the furin cleave of the COVID virus was particularly compatible with certain races. And it doesn't mean that those races disproportionately died, but chiefly with people of African descent. Right. Next of Caucasians, least of all people from Finland, and people and certain Germanic races, and then ethnic Chinese were also the least or less susceptible, and Ashkenazi Jews. All right. There was no suggestion ever that somebody designed it to be that way, that it was designed to preserve certain races. I was not suggesting that.
Right.
Pretty clear.
I feel like he's clarified it in his own comments. He clarified it when he was sitting right here in the interview we did. I have clarified it based on what he said. He did not say that COVID-19 was bioengineered to spare Jewish people or Chinese people. He said there is some evidence, you can say that it's not persuasive, but it does exist, this study and other evidence, that COVID has a disproportionate impact, racial impact. And given that that is the case, if that is the case, it would be theoretically possible to design a virus in the future, like COVID-19, that could disproportionately impact different races. Now, when I spoke with him, I pointed out that there are disproportionate impacts of COVID on races that don't actually have to do with the genetic composition of the virus, but just the fact that people of different races in different countries have different access to medical resources, have different health profiles, have different average age in that subpopulation, all sorts of things that will have an even greater impact on how prone you were or how bad a time you had with COVID. So I'm not persuaded that we were the receptor that is apparently absent according to that study for Ashkenazi Jews, that might not matter at all, or as much as whatever factors having to do with if that population is disproportionately well off or disproportionately lives in cities or there'd be all sorts of different reasons where it could have a higher or lesser impact, and he agreed with that. So it's really just the whole mainstream media talking point that he said this deeply anti-Semitic thing is just a gross mischaracterization of what he said. Right, and it is true what he's saying. He's saying what is represented in the data about how COVID-19 impacts race. He's not saying, as he has clarified many times, that the virus was intentionally designed to target these races. It's important to note that even if a lab leak theory ends up being true, that we find evidence that COVID-19 did originate, in a lab where they were doing research on SARS, it's still the case that it's unlikely they were developing a bioweapon and that they were just doing research on SARS and had no idea what the impact would be on race, especially because what you noted about socioeconomic factors likely being the result of the virus disproportionately affecting, for example, African Americans in the United States. It's been demonstrated that African Americans in the United States overwhelmingly are from lower income communities, live in areas where there's less access to health care, less access to doctors, and that is a reason why that community would be disproportionately affected, not because it's a bioweapon designed to affect their genetics more than another ethnic group. Right. Well, later, RFK Jr. also weighed in on President Joe Biden's cognitive state.
Do you believe that he is physically, mentally, cognitively strong enough to lead our country? This world is a dangerous place. Robert Kennedy Jr., you know that this is a dangerous place. Is he cognitively strong enough to be your president?
Well, he's never been very good with words.
Very diplomatic.
Yeah, RFK Jr. does not tend to, he's a cordial person. He tends not to bash Biden or Trump in very personal terms. He's really, he said that he likes Joe Biden as a human being, that they've had a warm relationship, but that he just doesn't like Joe Biden and Donald Trump's policies, and then explains why. And I really think there's something elevating of the discourse of keeping it, at that level. So good for him, I say.
Yeah, it's very well said. He's not so good with words. That's saying a lot with very few words. RFK Jr. is good with words. More rising after this.